Hi there, this week we'll talk about the Civil War, which goes on from 1861 to 1865. And where we left off last week was that we talked about South Carolina seceding from the Union immediately after Lincoln's election, okay, which will lead right into the Civil War. But I thought it would be interesting for us to take a look at the order of secession. You can see, it's numbered there, and it actually gives the exact dates of each one of the states in the South that seceded from the Union. So note that there's 4 states that actually don't secede from the Union until shots are fired in South Carolina during Fort Sumter. The other 4 secede, after that. But then there's also a good number, and Oklahoma at this point was Indian Territory, so it wasn't officially a state, that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states that are considered what we call border states. They don't secede from the Union, okay? Also, to correlate with this, these are also the states that have the least amount of slaves, okay? The more slaves, in general, correlated with a quicker secession from the Union, okay? So I want you to debunk the idea that the Civil War was not about slavery, because it 100% was about slavery. Slavery economically, politically, and the social aspect of it too, okay? Just like we talked about in our previous lectures. Okay, so let's go on to the war itself. So the North versus the South. Population-wise, the North was much more populated. The South only had 9 million, and 3.5 million of those were slaves. They had 23 states in the North, 11 in the South. Okay, but some advantages for both. In the North, they had manufacturing, a large number of railroad mileage, and frankly, they had a lot more financial resources. However, in the South, where most of the battles take place, it's a large territory, and it made it very difficult to conquer. Remember that the North wanted to keep the South together, so they mostly had to go to the South to try to kind of force them to stay in the Union. Where the South, they did launch some battles in the North, which we'll talk about, but mostly it's all fought mainly in the South. The other really big thing, and I actually think this is like the biggest advantage for the South, was their motivation. They had a motivation to preserve slavery, to preserve their way of life, and it was a big rallying cry for them. In the North, initially, Lincoln promises that it's only to keep the Union together. Now, that's going to change mid-war, and we're going to talk about that specifically, but there really wasn't a big motivation to keep the Union together. It wasn't as big of a rallying cry as it was in the South for the people in the South. Now, their armies were a significant difference, too. You had 2 million Union Army and 900,000 Confederate. The people in the Union, mostly poor, okay? In the Confederacy, also mostly poor, okay? Small farmers, slaveholding, only about 25% of all people in the South at this time actually owned slaves, but the people that owned slaves really control and run the government at that point. Both of the Union Army and the Confederate Army both have a draft. Right almost from the beginning of the war, I think at the beginning they thought they could do it without a draft, but it becomes very apparent that this war is going to take much longer than they predicted it would, and so they both have a need for a draft. Okay, so in 1860, and by the way, we're going to dub this the rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, which was a really common term that they used, because really it's the poor, as you can see, that are fighting, but it's really the rich people that control the governments in both parts of the country. And so they say a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And to further prove that, we can look at the drafts. In 1863, the Union issued a draft. You could hire a substitute. It was like $200 or $300 you could pay, and that doesn't seem like a lot of money now, but it's quite a bit of money, during that time period. And this leads to the New York City draft riots. I actually have a video clip for you to watch after you watch this portion of the module about the New York City draft riots, which is very important. I think you should watch. Probably many of you have never heard about that. But essentially, a lot of the poor people become very angry that they're fighting a Negro's war, okay? In the South, they had an 1862 Confederate draft, and they actually had something called a 20 Negro Law. So basically what happened was if you were an owner of at least 20 slaves or more, or you were an overseer of 20 slaves or more, so you're the person that's in charge of watching a rich man's property, okay, you're exempt from the war. And so you can see on both sides, they're exempting the wealthy. So it's really the poor men that are fighting this war. Just of interest, this is an image of a draft wheel that's in the New York, it's one of the New York museums. So it almost looked like a bingo draw, like with their numbers being called. So that's what a draft wheel would have looked like. Another thing that changes during this war is the fact that there's quite a bit of technology that comes out during the Civil War, and it really changes the face of the war itself too. So railroads were new and up and coming around the 1830s. This is going to easily move troops back and forth and supplies. New types of ships called the ironclads. The telegraph, which Lincoln was particularly obsessed with, would help with communication during the war. He would allegedly sit in the basement of the White House and listen to communication constantly, much to the chagrin of his wife, unfortunately. And so he would control the war as much as possible through telegraph communications. There were also observation balloons, which is pictured up here, and so that could be used for like reconnaissance and spying and seeing what the other, the enemy has. And then also the new deadlier, more precise rifle, and also something that I didn't put on here, which was the mini ball. The mini ball was a ammunition in a rifle, and when it would shoot, it would actually, when it went into the body, it would explode on impact. So it caused all kinds of gruesomeness and everything involved in that. Okay, so you can take a look at these railroad lines, and it becomes very apparent that the North definitely had an advantage. There were more rail lines, more interconnected. They could move troops and supplies much more easily in the North than they could have in the South. All right, so medicine also has some advantages, but it also has, makes some advances, I should say, but it has a lot of setbacks that caused a lot of the deaths in the war itself. Okay, it was pretty archaic. There are actually more people that die of disease in the Civil War than they do actual wounds. People also die in war camps. The war camps were atrocious. One in particular was a Confederate war camp known as Andersonville. There's actually a TNT special on Andersonville. It's a movie, but it's almost like a documentary too, but it's done like in a narrative format about Andersonville. Extremely notorious, horrible treatment. And the death toll, I think we really need to wrap our heads around this, okay? Now, we keep on, the numbers change from place to place. About 620,000 people died out of the six, that's an equivalent, if you match what the population was there today, that would be like losing 6 million people here in the United States. Now, I want you to really, really wrap your head around this one. If you combine all American efforts in all wars that America was involved in, starting with the French and Indian War, Revolutionary War, Spanish-American War, Mexican-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korean War, you total all of those, they are not going to reach 600,000 people dying. Okay, so that's a huge amount. Obviously, that's because we're fighting each other. But it was a very bloody, long war. An ugly war, and that's why we really take a look at it in depth, okay? Another thing that's invented at this time is photography around the 1850s, and so this is going to be the first war where it's almost in people's living rooms. They can see the death and destruction, and both sides, the Confederacy and the North, use this, propaganda to their advantage, okay? These kind of gruesome images are front and center. There's some debate on whether or not newspaper or photographers would stage these photos. Most historians, Civil War historians, say that's not really true. They didn't do that. There's really no evidence to that. But because, really, a lot of these, they really need to be staged. This is pretty gruesome. Okay, so the Norse plan was something called the Anaconda Plan. This is proposed by a gentleman named General Winfield Scott. And essentially, the whole idea is to strangle the South economically. Okay, so if you look at the map over here, you can see the idea was to create like a Union blockade, not to let ships in or out. And they needed, very importantly, and this is going to be important a little later on, to control the Mississippi River. So this will be like an essential part of it, okay? This would cause the strangulation of the South. They thought that this would be a quick end to the war. They stick to this plan, but it's not anywhere near as quick as they thought or hoped that it was going to be, okay? The war itself, this kind of shows you some of the major battle sites. There's over 300 battles in the Civil War. It's a ton. I can't be able to go into any of those. And unfortunately for you military historians, this is not going to be a lot of detail on the specific battles themselves. I can certainly direct you guys to some links that will give you that information. But you can tell that, you know, some are fought in the border states. Most of these are fought in the South. There are a couple efforts which we'll talk about, Gettysburg, of course, and Antietam. And really it's important to also note that the South was really winning the war very early on. Very disappointing to Lincoln, but they were winning almost every battle when in the beginning. In the West, we actually do see some, we saw some wins for the Union in the West. And this is really because of this man named Ulysses S. Grant. Now, he's got a bad rap in history a lot of historians, I shouldn't say historians, a lot of like Twitter historians and Facebook historians talk about how Ulysses S. Grant was a drunk and blah, 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 and he was so much less than Lee. And I would argue that that's, you know, okay, first of all, a lot of people drank during that time period. He did have some ups and downs in his life. He did graduate at the very bottom of his class in West Point. That's very true. But he was a very brilliant strategist. But because he really didn't have this kind of fame that, you know, General Lee had, and he was leading, you know, the South, and he was very well known, and he was such a war hero during the Mexican-American War. He graduated at the top of his class in West Point. All eyes were on him. And it is true that Lincoln did want him to run the Union Army. And Lee was actually torn. He decides to go with the South because Virginia seceded, so that made his decision for him. But, you know, Ulysses S. Grant, he was not the commander of the Army at the beginning. Lincoln goes through quite a few commanders. But Ulysses S. Grant eventually gains quite a bit of attention, and a lot of it is because of what he does here, okay? He wins a lot in the West, Fort Donelson and Fort Henry in particular. In Shiloh, also a very bloody battle. He withstood a Confederate attack on this, and we'll talk a little bit more a little later here about General Grant. Now, one thing I definitely want to point out is this idea of emancipation. I want to make sure that you guys understand, and I'll move this a little bit so you can read this, but essentially that Lincoln initially really did resist the idea of emancipation at first. There's some historians that said that Emancipation Proclamation was written from the very beginning of the war. It was tucked away in his front drawer, waiting for him to really issue this at the right time. I don't really know the answer to that. Okay, I do know that at the very beginning of the war, he was extremely insistent that this was a war not about slavery, but about keeping the Union together. Okay, as a matter of fact, there was a resolution in the Senate called the Crittenden Resolution that essentially stated the Union had no intention of interfering with slavery at all. Okay, I mean, they even put forward that. This starts to kind of unravel when the Union does win some battles, and when they win battles, some of the slaves come over, and what do they do with the slaves? Do they free them? What do they do with these slaves on these plantations and such that they get? So they dubbed them as contraband, much like property, so they confiscated them, okay, and eventually did free them. But a lot of the generals were avid, you know, abolitionists and really wanted to free them. And as a matter of fact, there's one general in particular, that's him here. He created a resolution to free the slaves because he thought that there needed to be something like that. He also thought, like many of the generals did, that slaves would be the best soldiers out there because they were fighting for their freedom. And so he really felt like, you know, that would work. But Lincoln rescinds this, believe it or not. He struggles with this idea of emancipation. What he was afraid of, I think, issuing it too early would mean that, you know, people that did not want to fight over slavery, he thought that they really wanted to fight over the Union. And so he kind of battles with this, but, you know, between the urgencies of his generals, and also there was also an element of international support. The South was actually asking for help from France and Great Britain in particular. They supplied them with majority of their cotton. Remember, the South was supplying 80% of the world's cotton at this point. So, you know, one of the things was the South, Great Britain and France, they were kind of entertaining these ideas. Maybe they will do that. However, when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued and this changes to be a war over slavery, Great Britain and France are out because they've already, you know, abolished slavery. They didn't want to enter a war about slavery. So strategically, the idea of emancipation started to grow much more on Lincoln, but he also knew that he had to issue emancipation at the right time. Okay, and so the right time ended up being this battle called the Battle of Antietam, which is in Maryland. And this happens on September 17th of 1862. It is the single bloodiest day of battle. The bloodiest battle of the Civil War was Gettysburg, but this is the single bloodiest day of the battle itself. So it was fought in Maryland, which was a border state, and it was technically a draw. But the Union kind of claimed a victory because they were able to repeal the Confederacy out of the border states. Lincoln said, well, this is enough of a win, even though it's not like a huge win. This is enough of a win for me to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, and so 5 days after Antietam, on September 22nd, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation that stated that declared all slaves in Confederately held states would be free. Okay? Now, it's important, and we're going to look at the wording on this. He did not free all the slaves. Remember those border states we looked at? They had less slaves than the Deep South did, but they had slaves. So those slaves in the border states were not free because they were not technically out of the Union. They were not rebelling. Okay, so it takes the 13th Amendment at the end of 1865, actually after Lincoln died. It was his brainchild. He definitely wanted to issue this and pushes the 13th Amendment to free the slaves. But the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all the slaves. So I want to debunk that myth too. Okay? This will, though, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation really alters history, and it alters Lincoln's thinking. He begins to open up his mind more about equality of blacks and things like this. So this is going to alter history in a lot of different ways. And I think I've got some text here of the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of the words that I think are the most important, okay? And I will actually put a link here for the Emancipation Proclamation so you can visit the full text of it. It is not a long document. Okay, and by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of the states are and henceforth shall be free. Okay, so within designated states, those are the ones that are rebelling. And another important thing that is mentioned in the Emancipation Proclamation, such persons, freed slaves, of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said services. Okay, so he's also suggesting that if you're healthy, you should join the war if you're a freed black slave, okay, which many of them do. As a matter of fact, the most famous of those regiments was the 54th Regiment. And, you know, you really just have to understand that participating in this war for many black soldiers was a very liberating experience. 130 former soldiers actually become part of the Reconstruction government. Okay, so they become, you know, members locally, statewide, and even nationwide political representatives in the country post-war. We also need to understand that even though there was emancipation, there was not equality. Okay, and that's going to take a long time. We're going to talk about Reconstruction in our next presentation, and Reconstruction will really go into what happens, and really the end of it is what signifies a decline in black rights too. Okay, but the 54th Regiment was the very first African American regiment that was organized under the Union Army. There's a fantastic movie called Glory. If you've never seen it, it came out in 1989. Pretty sure you can see it on Prime or Netflix. I highly recommend it. It's a great movie. I also have a video clip that I'm going to give you about the 54th that you should watch. Also very good. Okay, so women did have a role. Nurses, factory workers. This is where Clara Barton really steps in, and she, gets her fame, and she becomes head of the Nurse Corps and also Sanitation Commission for Lincoln. Because one thing that is really recognized for women during the war was the fact that the sanitation was horrible, which was probably causing a lot of the disease and death, in addition to the battle wounds in the Civil War. And little known story too, women were seen as more equipped and better to handle some of the gore of the Civil War. At the beginning of the Civil War, there was actually more men that were nurses than females, but a lot of times, and this is just stated facts, but a lot of times men were drinking quite a bit, especially in the ambulatory corps. And, of course, that doesn't bode well. A lot of them had very difficult time dealing with it. So slowly but surely in the Civil War, women start to become more prevalent as nurses than men do. And again, that's where Clara Barton and people like that come out. In the South, however, there were women nurses, not as many, but a lot of them had to take the burden on of the plantations and the farms. And women in the South, post-Civil War, are really going to be the ones in charge of keeping the memory of the South alive and the memory of the soldiers, because for quite a while, Civil War soldiers from the South, Confederacy, weren't allowed into any kind of military gravestone or receive any kind of military honors. So a lot of women in the South take that burden upon themselves. Major victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Remember us talking about the importance of capturing the Mississippi River. This is the win, and of course this is our boy Grant. He captures the city of Jackson, Mississippi, and then he begins to besiege the town of Vicksburg. Vicksburg right here is located right on the Mississippi. He needed that in order to control the Mississippi. Now he does a siege and not a battle, so that's important because a siege is literal surrounding of a city, and you effectively starve them out. Okay, so you won't let them in or out. And so essentially this goes on for 47 days. So the Battle of Vicksburg lasts 47 days long. The Siege of Vicksburg lasts 47 days long. They finally do give up, and they did. They were resorting to eating rats and all kinds of things. No cannibalism or anything like that. But essentially they do surrender on July 4th, which is actually the day after Lincoln had found out about the win at Gettysburg. And now, importantly, the Union controls the Mississippi River. This is part of their big plan here. The next thing, of course, was the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the linchpin of all the battles. So General Lee, he makes kind of this bold attempt to go for the North and to attack in the North, and his plan was then to go take Washington. And for the first couple days of the battle, they were actually winning. The South looked like they were winning, but after some strategical mistakes, they lose and they retreat. Okay, this was an enormous win for the Union. The Confederacy were never able to recover offensively after this. And Lincoln makes a very important speech at the dedication of the people that died there, the Gettysburg Address, which we'll talk about here in this next slide. Okay, and there's actually the Gettysburg Address right here. It's very short, only 272 words long. Extremely important to really show Lincoln's changed thinking at this time. Okay, essentially, like I just mentioned, it was a dedication of a new cemetery at Gettysburg, kind of like putting the soldiers at rest who had died in this bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It was only 272 words, but he calls on Americans to adhere to the words of the Declaration of Independence, which were 7 years ago, right? So a score is 20 years, so that's 7, that's 87 years before, talking about all men being created equal. And he really puts it on America and says, we're not living up to this, okay? We need to do that. He also mentions that we should forgive others and we should rebirth our nation and everything like that. So he makes a lot of important statements here in the Gettysburg very short address. Okay, to wrap the war up, we have to bring in the heavy. Okay, this turns into really at the end of the war, a war of attrition. Grant really just wants to literally kill everybody. This really changes kind of the thinking during this time. He becomes the war commander at the time. Again, this war of attrition. And he launches a man named General William Tecumseh Sherman to march essentially and just break the will of the people. There's a very good video clip about Sherman that I encourage you to watch. It's very good about this that I'll put here below it. But essentially marches from Atlanta to Savannah and literally just destroys everything in his path. You know, he burns houses, barns, he takes the livestock, he gives them to free slaves. And so this is where the term 40 acres and a mule comes from, because he gives to the freed slaves 40 acres and a mule from what he's confiscated as contraband. And I like to refer to him as the Shermanator. I mean, take a look at him. I mean, he's a tough looking dude. He did not play around. But I will tell you that if you go in Georgia, they still hate him. You know, like Sherman's a 4-letter word to them. So, but, you know, incredibly intense, very much an abolitionist on many, many levels, fierce dude. Okay, so the finale is, of course, Appomattox Courthouse, which is actually a city and not a place in Virginia. Essentially what happened is that Richmond falls to the Union. Lee knows that it's over, and he surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, you know, in this town in Virginia. And this is a famous rendition of him signing. That's Grant, and this is Lee over here. It does officially end the war. Grant is going to get a lot of flack for that because he actually pardons Lee and his officers. The only one really to face treason charges and die by hanging was the guy that ran Andersonville prison, the prison camp, who, you know, all kinds of atrocities that he committed. So, So yeah, that was officially the end of the war. Okay, and unfortunately, we're going to come to our next slide, which was the assassination of Lincoln. Okay, 5 days after Appomattox, Lincoln is shot in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. Now, he dies the next day, so his death actually was April 15th. The impact on this was actually pretty negative for the South. Obviously, it was sad for the country. But Lincoln was prepared to forgive the South. And he actually, in a second inaugural speech, which was made not too long before that, he was won his second term at the end of 1864. So 1865 is made his second inaugural speech, and he actually says malice towards none. And he says it's time to forgive. It's time for us to move on. And for the South, this ends up being a very negative thing for them. Okay, there's some conspiracy theories out there that John Wilkes Booth had it was a big conspiracy. The South wanted to kill him. There was like a conspiracy of like him and a couple other guys. One guy does go through and beats Sumner, Secretary of State, to a pulp. Doesn't kill him. And also there was the idea to kill Johnson, and that guy apparently was drinking in a bar, never goes through with it. So there's a little bit of a conspiracy involved in this, some people that didn't know about this. But as far as higher ups, I would argue that it would really be against their best interest to do this. So there's been no evidence of that, really solid evidence. And I would say that really didn't happen. Okay, so the last thing you guys are going to see is on Reconstruction. And this will tie everything together and really end our class, believe it or not, and all the lectures. We'll see you guys on the next lecture.